The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Horizon Hotel in Manhattan sparkled like 1,000 stars, casting their ethereal glow over the annual charity gala that had drawn New York's elite. Among them stood Sarah Mitchell, a vision in emerald silk, her honey blonde hair cascading in elegant waves. At 32, she had built the city's most successful event planning company from scratch, earning respect in a world that had once dismissed her as just another small-town girl from Vermont. "Your work tonight is exceptional as always, darling," William Lancaster whispered in her ear, his arm possessively wrapped around her waist. At 45, he was one of Wall Street's most powerful investment bankers, and for the past 2 years, Sarah's fiancé. Their engagement had been the talk of Manhattan's social circles, the self-made businesswoman and the financial mogul, a modern fairy tale in the making. Little did Sarah know that this night, her greatest professional triumph, would become the beginning of her devastating fall. The ballroom buzzed with appreciation as New York's wealthiest pledged millions to children's education. Sarah caught snippets of praise from every corner, the Mitchell touch, they called it. Her heart swelled with pride, not just for herself but for her team of 50 employees who depended on her. "Ms. Mitchell?" Jessica, her assistant, approached with an iPad in hand, her expression unusually tense. "There's something you need to see in the office. Immediately." Sarah excused herself from William's side, following Jessica to the makeshift event management office they'd set up in one of the hotel's executive suites. The click of her heels against marble floors echoed through the corridor, a rhythm that had always given her confidence. Tonight, it felt like a countdown. The company accounts, Jessica's voice trembled as she pulled up the banking app. They're empty. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. "That's impossible. We have over 5 million in reserves." Her fingers flew across the screen, accessing account after account. "Nothing. Not even enough to cover next week's payroll." "There's more," Jessica's voice cracked. "The corporate credit lines, they're maxed out." "All of them? And the lease for our office building?" "It's been terminated." Sarah's knees weakened as she sank into a chair. "How? When?" "All transactions were authorized with your credentials and signatures. Most of them processed within the last hour." A cold realization crept up Sarah's spine. Only one other person had access to all her accounts, all her passwords, all her trust. The door opened, and William stepped in, his trademark confident smile replaced by something darker. Behind him stood Victoria Lancaster, his wife Sarah had never known existed, and James Morrison, her company's biggest competitor. "I must say, Sarah dear, you've outdone yourself tonight," William's voice dripped with mock praise. "This gala will be remembered as the night Mitchell Events made its grand exit from the New York scene." "William, what have you done?" "Business, darling. Just business. Victoria and I have been looking to expand our investment portfolio. James here needed a leg up in the event planning world. You were the perfect means to all our ends." He adjusted his cufflinks, the ones she'd given him for their first anniversary. "Did you really think someone like me would marry someone like you? A small-town nobody?" The truth crashed through her like a tidal wave. Every tender moment, every promise, every shared dream, all orchestrated for this betrayal. She'd given him access to everything, believing in their future together. "Your resignation letter has already been sent to all major clients," Victoria stepped forward, her Louboutins clicking against the floor. "Rather shocking, really, how you decided to sell everything to Morrison Events at such a bargain price. But then again, people will believe anything about a woman who embezzled millions from her own charity events." Sarah's head snapped up. "What?" William smiled coldly. "The evidence is quite compelling. Anonymous tips have already been sent to the relevant authorities. Your signatures on everything, Sarah. Every single document." The room spun as the magnitude of their scheme became clear. They hadn't just taken her money, they'd destroyed her reputation, her career, her life. "Why?" she managed to whisper. "Because we could," James Morrison replied simply. "New York's a big game, Sarah. You were just too small town to play it right." They left her there, surrounded by the ruins of everything she'd built. Through the walls, she could hear the gala continuing, her last masterpiece becoming her funeral march. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages from concerned clients, panicked employees, and increasingly, reporters seeking comment on the emerging scandal. In one night, Sarah Mitchell had lost everything. Her company, her reputation, her future, and her heart lay shattered on the floor of a luxury hotel suite. But as she stood there, trembling with shock and grief, something else stirred within her, a spark of the fierce determination that had brought her from a small Vermont farm to the heights of New York society. They thought they'd left her with nothing. They thought they'd written the end of her story. But Sarah Mitchell had learned long ago from her grandmother, steel is forged in fire, and the strongest souls are shaped by adversity. As she walked out of the Grand Horizon Hotel that night, leaving behind the glittering world she'd worked so hard to join, Sarah made a promise to herself. This wasn't the end of her story, it was only the beginning. They had taken everything from her, but they had forgotten one crucial thing: they'd left her with nothing left to lose. And a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous player of all. The Vermont countryside stretched endlessly before Sarah as she drove her beaten-up Honda Civic, the only possession the authorities hadn't seized, toward her grandmother's farmhouse. 3 months had passed since that fateful night at the Grand Horizon Hotel, 3 months of legal battles, media scrutiny, and the slow, painful process of watching her life crumble to pieces. The criminal investigation into her alleged embezzlement had frozen all her personal accounts. Former clients had filed lawsuits, former employees had given damning interviews to the press, and her face had been splashed across every tabloid in New York with headlines like "Society's Sweetheart Scams Millions from Children's Charities." Only Jessica had stood by her side, refusing to believe the lies. But Sarah had forced her to take a job with another company. At least one of them should survive this massacre. The familiar creaking of the farmhouse's screen door brought tears to her eyes as her grandmother, Eleanor Hayes, stepped onto the porch. At 75, Eleanor still stood tall and proud, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Well," Eleanor said, looking at Sarah's designer suitcase, the last remnant of her New York life, "I always said that city would either make you or break you. Looks like it did both." Sarah dropped her suitcase and fell into her grandmother's arms, finally allowing herself to break down. Eleanor held her tightly, just as she had when Sarah was a little girl who'd fallen off her first horse. "You smell like lavender," Sarah whispered through her tears, "just like always." "And you smell like expensive perfume and heartbreak," Eleanor replied, stroking her hair. "Come on in. I've got coffee brewing and a story you need to hear." Inside, the farmhouse looked exactly as it had when Sarah left 10 years ago. The same checkered curtains, the same worn wooden table where she'd done her homework, the same wall of family photographs. But one photo she'd never noticed before caught her eye: a stunning young woman in 1960s fashion, standing proudly in front of a Boston department store. "Is that you?" Sarah asked, wiping her tears. Eleanor poured 2 cups of coffee and settled into her favorite rocking chair. "That's me, all right. Outside Hayes & Company, the department store your great-grandfather built from nothing." She paused, taking a sip. "The same store the Lancasters stole from our family 40 years ago." Sarah nearly dropped her cup. "What?" "William Lancaster's father, Richard, was your grandfather's business partner. They'd built the store into a chain of luxury boutiques across New England." Eleanor's eyes hardened. "Then one day, Richard convinced your grandfather to sign some papers. Said it was routine refinancing. 2 weeks later, we discovered Richard had transferred everything to his name. Your grandfather had a heart attack when he found out. Died right there in the store he'd built." Sarah's mind raced. "But that's exactly what William did to me." Like father, like son, Eleanor nodded grimly. "The Lancasters have been destroying families for generations. But here's what they never understood about us Hayes women: we don't stay down." She stood and walked to an old trunk in the corner, pulling out yellowed newspapers and photographs. "After your grandfather died, everyone expected me to sell what little we had left and live quietly in shame. Instead, I spent 5 years gathering evidence, building alliances, and planning. In the end, I managed to save 3 of our stores and enough money to send your mother to college." "But the Lancasters still won," Sarah said bitterly. "Did they?" Eleanor smiled mysteriously. "Richard Lancaster died alone in a nursing home, abandoned by his family. His empire crumbled because he never understood that true success isn't built on betrayal. And now his son seems determined to repeat his mistakes. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah tensed, but Eleanor remained calm. "Right on time," she said, standing to answer it. A tall man in his late 30s entered, his presence filling the room. His sharp suit screamed Wall Street, but his kind eyes spoke of something deeper. "Miss Hayes," he nodded to Eleanor, then turned to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Michael Sterling. I've been looking forward to meeting you." Michael's a former partner at Lancaster Investment Group, Eleanor explained. He left the firm 6 months ago due to ethical disagreements. "William Lancaster is just the tip of the iceberg," Michael said, setting his briefcase on the table. "The firm's entire operation is built on schemes like what they did to you. They find successful businesses, infiltrate them, and strip them bare. But they've finally made a mistake, they got sloppy with your case." He opened his briefcase, revealing stacks of documents. "I've spent the last 3 months gathering evidence. Forged signatures, backdated documents, illegal transfers, enough to not only clear your name but to bring down the entire Lancaster empire." Sarah's heart raced. "Why would you help me?" Michael's expression darkened. "Because 5 years ago, they did the same thing to my sister's company. She..." He paused, pain flickering across his face. She couldn't handle the shame. "I promised myself I'd never let them destroy another life." Eleanor placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "The question is, dear, what do you want to do with this information? You could clear your name, maybe even get some compensation. Or we could take everything," Sarah finished, a new fire lighting in her eyes. "Not just my company, but their entire corrupt empire." Michael nodded approvingly. "It won't be easy. The Lancasters have friends in high places, and Victoria's family, the Blackwoods, practically owns half of Manhattan's legal firms." "Good thing I'm just a small-town nobody, then," Sarah said, her grandmother's fighting spirit surging through her veins. "No one expects much from us." Over the next few hours, they pored over Michael's documents, forming the foundation of a plan that would shake New York society to its core. Sarah's experience in event planning had taught her how to orchestrate complex operations, handle multiple players, and most importantly, how to make people see exactly what she wanted them to see. "First," Michael said, "we need to establish a new identity for you. The Lancasters will be watching Sarah Mitchell, but they won't notice Rachel Hayes, a quiet Midwestern investor with impeccable credentials." "And a 7-figure account," Eleanor added, pulling out a bank statement that made Sarah gasp. "Grandma, I can't take your money." "You're not taking it," Eleanor's eyes twinkled. "You're investing it. Consider it 40 years of interest on what the Lancasters owe our family." As the sun set over the Vermont hills, casting long shadows across the farmhouse floor, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since that night at the Grand Horizon: hope. But this wasn't the naive hope of a small-town girl making it big in New York. This was something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. "Remember," Eleanor said as they finalized their initial plans, "the best revenge isn't just about taking back what's yours. It's about making sure they never forget who took it from them." Sarah looked at her reflection in the window, barely recognizing the woman who stared back. The soft waves of her honey blonde hair and designer clothes that had defined Sarah Mitchell would soon be replaced by Rachel Hayes' sleek dark bob and understated elegance. But the biggest transformation wasn't external, it was the steel forming in her heart, tempered by betrayal and forged in the fire of revenge. 3 months, Michael said, checking his watch. "That's how long we have until Lancaster Investment Group's annual shareholder meeting. If we're going to do this, that's our window." Sarah picked up her grandmother's photo from 1960, drawing strength from the determination in those familiar eyes. "Then we better get started. After all," she smiled, a hint of ice in her expression, "I have a charity gala to plan." The reflection that stared back at Rachel Hayes from the mirror of her penthouse apartment at the Wellington, one of Manhattan's most exclusive addresses, bore little resemblance to Sarah Mitchell. Gone were the honey blonde waves, replaced by a sophisticated dark bob that framed her face in severe lines. Blue contact lenses concealed her natural green eyes, and 3 months of intensive training with Michael had transformed her once warm demeanor into something altogether more calculating. Perfect timing, Michael said, entering her bedroom with a tablet in hand. Victoria Lancaster just RSVP'd to the Children's Hope Foundation launch next week. Apparently, our mysterious new charity organization has everyone buzzing. Rachel, as Sarah now thought of herself, smiled coldly. Amazing what a few well-placed rumors about $1 billion endowment can do. The Children's Hope Foundation was their first major move, a supposedly new charitable organization backed by old money from the Midwest. In reality, it was their Trojan horse into Manhattan's elite social circle, funded by Eleanor's savings and Michael's connections. Jessica called, Michael added, his expression softening slightly at the mention of Sarah's former assistant. In the past month, he'd helped Jessica secure a position as Victoria Lancaster's personal event coordinator, their eyes and ears inside the Lancaster household. Victoria's been complaining about staff turnover. Apparently, she's gone through 3 personal assistants in the past month. How unfortunate, Rachel murmured, applying her signature red lipstick, a shade darker than Sarah would have ever worn. I suppose she'll be desperate for someone competent and discreet. Enter Claire Thompson, Michael nodded, pulling up a resume on his tablet. Top of her class at Northwestern, impeccable references, and most importantly, absolutely desperate for a job after a messy scandal at her last position. Which, of course, has been perfectly scrubbed from the internet, leaving just enough whispers to make her seem vulnerable but not dangerous. Rachel stood, smoothing down her Chanel suit. Has our friend at the temp agency placed the file on Victoria's desk? This morning. Jessica says Victoria's already reviewing it. Rachel walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The view from the Wellington was everything William had once promised her they'd have together. Now she had it on her own terms, paid for with what Eleanor called justice money. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Their private investigator, Marcus Chen, entered with a thick folder. You're going to want to see this, he said, spreading photos across Rachel's designer coffee table. The images showed William Lancaster leaving an upscale apartment building in Boston, looking considerably less polished than his usual Wall Street appearance. In several photos, he was accompanied by a striking redhead. Meet Rebecca Sinclair, Marcus said, pulling out a detailed dossier. William's been visiting her apartment twice a month for the past year. She's a former model, now running a small art gallery in Boston. More importantly, she's 3 months pregnant. Rachel's hand froze on her coffee cup. Does Victoria know? Not yet, Marcus smiled. But the real bombshell? Rebecca's gallery is funded entirely by Lancaster Investment Group through a series of shell companies. The paperwork is sloppy, they clearly never expected anyone to look too closely. Michael whistled low. Victoria's prenup with William has an ironclad infidelity clause. If this gets out, we're not going to expose it, Rachel cut in, her mind racing with possibilities. At least, not yet. This is leverage we might need later. She turned to Marcus. Keep watching them. I want to know every time William sneaks off to Boston. The intercom buzzed, their signal that another member of their team had arrived. Amanda Chen, Marcus's sister and a former cybersecurity expert, entered with her laptop. The digital infrastructure at Lancaster Investment Group is a joke, she announced, pulling up complex diagrams of network architectures. They haven't updated their security protocols in 3 years. More importantly, I found something interesting in their internal communications. She pointed to a series of emails between William and James Morrison, dating back 2 years. They didn't just target your company, Sarah. They've been systematically taking down female-owned businesses across New York. Morrison provides the industry connections, the Lancasters provide the financial manipulation, and Victoria's family law firm handles the paperwork. Rachel's blood boiled, but her face remained impassive. How many companies? 17 in the past 5 years. All following the same pattern: gain trust, fabricate scandals, force a sale. Most of the women ended up leaving New York. 2 filed for bankruptcy. 1. Amanda hesitated. Committed suicide, Michael finished grimly. Like my sister. Rachel walked to a hidden safe behind an abstract painting, pulling out a leather-bound notebook, her grandmother's journal from 40 years ago. History repeats itself, she murmured, flipping through the yellowed pages. Richard Lancaster did the same thing in Boston. Like father, like son. There's more, Amanda added. They're planning something big. I found preliminary paperwork for a new holding company, targeting at least 5 major women-owned businesses in Manhattan. Their next victims, Rachel's voice turned to ice. Unless we stop them first. Michael checked his watch. Victoria's charity committee meeting starts in an hour. Are you ready? Rachel, who would soon become Claire Thompson, picked up a Hermes bag containing her Claire disguise glasses, a more conservative outfit, and a resume that would appeal to Victoria's ego. Remember, Michael cautioned, Victoria's smarter than she lets on. One wrong move. I know who I'm dealing with, Rachel cut him off. I spent 2 years studying William's tactics. Victoria's just as calculating, but she has one weakness her husband doesn't, pride. She needs to feel superior to everyone around her, especially other women. Which is exactly why Claire Thompson is perfect, Amanda nodded. Competent enough to be useful, broken enough to be unthreatening. Rachel took one last look in the mirror, then began transforming herself into Claire. The glasses, the slightly ill-fitting blazer, the nervous habit of tucking hair behind her ear, every detail designed to make Victoria see exactly what she wanted to see, another young woman she could control. The temp agency will call Victoria in exactly 17 minutes, Marcus confirmed. Just enough time for her to feel like she discovered Claire's resume herself. Jessica's already planted the seeds, Michael added. She mentioned hearing good things about Claire from her previous employer, just vague enough to seem credible. Rachel picked up her phone, looking at the background image, a photo of her grandmother standing proudly in front of Hayes and Company. Did you know, she said softly, that when the Lancasters stole my grandmother's store, they kept the Hayes name for another 5 years? They wanted everyone to watch the Hayes legacy crumble under their management. She turned to her team, her blue contact lenses glinting with purpose. They think reputation is everything in this city. Let's show them how right they are. As Rachel left her penthouse to become Claire Thompson, she remembered something her grandmother had told her that first night back in Vermont: the best cons aren't about deceiving people, dear. They're about giving people exactly what they want to believe. Victoria Lancaster wanted to believe in her own superiority. William wanted to believe in his invincibility. And James Morrison wanted to believe he was always the smartest person in the room. Rachel was about to give them everything they wanted, right up until the moment she took everything they had. The game was finally beginning, and this time, she was dealing the cards. Victoria Lancaster's office at the Blackwood Legal Tower embodied everything about its occupant: elegant, intimidating, and carefully crafted to make others feel inferior. Rachel, now fully embodied as Claire Thompson, sat perfectly still in one of the uncomfortable visitor chairs, her hands folded demurely in her lap, projecting an air of nervous anticipation. Your references are interesting, Victoria mused, manicured fingers trailing over Claire's resume. Top marks at Northwestern, prestigious internships, and then, that unfortunate incident at Goldman Sachs. She looked up, steel gray eyes searching for weakness. Would you care to explain what happened? Claire tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous tick Rachel had practiced for hours. I trusted the wrong person. Made the mistake of believing in office romance. Her voice trembled slightly. He was married. When his wife found out, he claimed I'd been stalking him. The HR investigation cleared me, but the damage was done, Victoria finished, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. Men can be so cruel, can't they? Yes, Mrs. Lancaster, Claire whispered, letting a single tear slip down her cheek before quickly wiping it away. I'm sorry, I promised myself I wouldn't. Victoria's smile widened fractionally, a predator sensing wounded prey. Now, dear. We've all had our hearts broken. The question is, what did you learn from it? That trust has to be earned, Claire replied, her voice strengthening slightly. And that competence is the best revenge. Victoria raised an perfectly shaped eyebrow. Interesting perspective. Tell me, what do you know about the Children's Hope Foundation? Only what everyone's been saying, that it's backed by old Midwest money and could revolutionize children's healthcare. Their launch gala next week is the most exclusive event of the season. Claire paused, then added carefully, I heard you're on the honorary committee. Indeed, Victoria preened slightly. Though their CEO, Rachel Hayes, remains frustratingly mysterious. No one seems to know much about her. Sometimes mystery adds value, Claire offered tentatively. Especially in Manhattan society. Victoria's laugh was like cut crystal, sharp and cold. Quite right. Well, Miss Thompson, I believe we can help each other. I need someone who understands discretion and knows their place. You need a fresh start. Shall we say a 3-month trial period? Thank you, Mrs. Lancaster. I won't disappoint you. See that you don't. Jessica will show you around. You start immediately. Outside Victoria's office, Jessica waited with a tablet and a barely concealed smirk. This way, Miss Thompson. I'll brief you on Mrs. Lancaster's schedule. In the elevator, away from prying eyes and ears, Jessica whispered, she totally bought it. You should have seen her face when she discovered your resume this morning, like a cat finding cream. And William? In Boston again. Victoria thinks he's overseeing a new investment, but... Jessica's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. I made sure she found a suspicious receipt from Tiffany's in his jacket pocket this morning. Small enough to dismiss, big enough to plant a seed of doubt. Rachel allowed herself a small smile. Phase 1 was complete, she was inside the Lancaster fortress. The next week passed in a whirlwind of carefully orchestrated moments. Claire proved herself invaluable to Victoria, anticipating needs before they arose, handling crises with quiet efficiency, and most importantly, presenting herself as harmlessly devoted to her new employer. Meanwhile, Rachel Hayes remained tantalizingly out of reach. The Children's Hope Foundation launch gala approached, and Manhattan society buzzed with speculation about the mysterious Midwest heiress who never seemed to be photographed clearly. The night of the gala arrived with appropriate fanfare. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with ice sculptures and crystal decorations catching the light like frozen stars. Rachel Hayes would make her first public appearance tonight, but for now, Claire Thompson stood quietly behind Victoria Lancaster, clipboard in hand. The guest list is absolutely perfect, Victoria declared, surveying the arriving crowd. Though I still can't believe Rachel Hayes insisted on inviting Sarah Mitchell's former assistant. She shot a pointed look at Jessica, who was directing the catering staff. I believe Ms. Hayes has a policy of supporting women who've been affected by corporate fraud, Claire offered carefully. Something about understanding how one person's actions can devastate entire families. Victoria's expression darkened. That little con artist Mitchell got exactly what she deserved. Speaking of which, she nodded toward the entrance, where William had just arrived with James Morrison. Rachel felt her heart rate increase slightly at the sight of him, but Claire's expression remained perfectly bland. William looked exactly as she remembered, handsome, polished, and utterly false. James Morrison trailed behind him like an eager shadow. Claire, be a dear and make sure my husband has everything he needs, Victoria instructed. And keep an eye on that new Boston acquisition he keeps talking about. I want to know every detail. Of course, Mrs. Lancaster. Rachel approached William, wearing Claire's invisibility like armor. He barely glanced at her as she took his coat and offered him champagne. Just another faceless servant in his world. Any sign of our mysterious hostess? James asked, adjusting his bow tie nervously. Patience, William replied smoothly. Though I must admit, I'm curious about this Rachel Hayes. Her foundation's financial backing is impressive, but something feels. He was interrupted by a sudden hush falling over the crowd. At the top of the grand staircase, a figure had appeared, tall, elegant, and commanding attention without seeming to try. Rachel Hayes wore a midnight blue gown that seemed to absorb light, her dark hair swept up to reveal a face that was striking but somehow difficult to focus on. My God, James whispered. She looks like someone we know, William finished, his expression troubled. But I can't quite. Rachel descended the stairs with measured grace, accepting introductions but never lingering too long with any one person. She was everywhere and nowhere, present but untouchable. Claire watched from the shadows as confusion flickered across William's face every time he tried to get a clear look at their hostess. It was Amanda's masterpiece, subtle prosthetics and carefully applied makeup that made Rachel Hayes' features seem to shift slightly depending on the angle and lighting. Combined with the dark contacts and hair, she was a ghost of familiarity that would haunt William's dreams. William Lancaster, Rachel Hayes's voice carried just the right amount of Midwest warmth as she finally approached him. "I've heard so much about you." "All good things, I hope," he replied with his practiced charm. "Oh no," Rachel smiled, "steel beneath silk." "Not all. But isn't that what makes life interesting? The contrast between appearance and reality?" William's smile faltered slightly. Before he could respond, Rachel had moved on, leaving him with an unsettled expression that brought fierce joy to Claire's carefully blank face. The evening proceeded perfectly, with Rachel Hayes announcing a revolutionary new program to support women entrepreneurs affected by corporate fraud. The irony of Victoria and William applauding politely was almost too delicious. But the real triumph came later, when Claire accidentally overheard a conversation between William and James Morrison in a quiet corner. "Something's not right about her," William muttered. "The way she looks, the way she talks, it reminds me of." "Don't be paranoid," James scoffed. "Mitchell's probably waiting tables in Vermont by now. This Hayes woman is old money, you can smell it on her. We should be focusing on how to get the foundation's backing for our new ventures." "You're right, of course," William sighed. "I'm seeing ghosts." "No, William," Rachel thought, watching him through Claire's eyes. "You're not seeing ghosts. You're seeing your future." As the gala wound down, Victoria gathered her things, completely unaware that her new assistant had just orchestrated the entire evening. "Well done, Claire," she said absently. "Though next time, try to be a little less invisible. Wallflowers never get ahead in this city." Rachel smiled Claire's submissive smile, knowing that in 3 months, Victoria Lancaster would regret every condescending word. The seeds were planted. William's paranoia, Victoria's false sense of security, and James Morrison's greed would do the rest. Phase 2 was about to begin, and this time, the stakes were much higher. Because Rachel Hayes hadn't just created a charity foundation, she'd created the perfect trap. And the Lancasters had just stepped right into it. In her grandmother's voice, she heard the old saying, "Revenge is a dish best served cold." But Rachel knew better now. The best revenge was served like the finest champagne, sparkling, intoxicating, and guaranteed to leave one hell of a hangover. 1 month after the Children's Hope Foundation Gala, Manhattan's social scene was abuzz with 2 distinct but equally intriguing developments. Rachel Hayes had become the city's most sought-after philanthropist, while Claire Thompson had transformed into Victoria Lancaster's indispensable right hand. Mrs. Lancaster, Claire entered Victoria's office early one morning, her demeanor perfectly professional. The flowers from Mr. Lancaster's trip to Boston arrived. Victoria glanced up from her computer, her expression flickering briefly. "Boston again? I don't recall him mentioning." "Oh." Claire's eyes widened with calculated alarm. "I'm so sorry, I assumed you knew. Should I not have?" No, Victoria waved her hand dismissively, but Claire caught the slight tremor in her fingers. "William's business travels are his own affair. Though." She paused, studying Claire carefully. "You've proven quite reliable these past weeks. Perhaps you could keep track of his schedule for me?" "Purely for coordination purposes, of course." "Of course, Mrs. Lancaster," Claire nodded, mentally noting how the seeds of suspicion planted at the gala were beginning to sprout. Later that afternoon, in Rachel Hayes's penthouse, Michael reviewed their progress. Victoria started tracking William's movements, he confirmed, showing Rachel the activity logs from Victoria's private investigator, courtesy of Amanda's cyber surveillance. She's also been making discreet inquiries about divorce attorneys. Right on schedule, Rachel smiled, removing her Claire disguise and transforming back into Rachel Hayes. "And Rebecca Sinclair?" 4 months pregnant now, Marcus reported. "But here's where it gets interesting, she's been meeting with James Morrison behind William's back. Our surveillance caught them having dinner 3 times last week." Rachel's eyes gleamed. "Morrison's trying to play both sides. He knows Victoria's suspicious and wants to ensure he has leverage no matter which Lancaster comes out on top." "There's more," Amanda added, pulling up financial records on her laptop. "Morrison's company is hemorrhaging money. The businesses they stole from Sarah Mitchell and the others? They're all underperforming. Turns out running successful companies requires more than just stealing them. Perfect, Rachel purred. Time to accelerate phase 3. Michael, is everything ready for tomorrow's board meeting? Michael nodded, pulling out a thick folder. Rachel Hayes now owns 12% of Lancaster Investment Group through various shell companies. Small enough to avoid triggering any alarms, large enough to demand attention. The presentation is prepared, highlighting the firms, concerning performance metrics. Rachel walked to her closet, selecting a power suit that would make Rachel Hayes shine while still being unmemorable enough to maintain her ethereal quality. And our friend from the SEC? Agent Thompson, no relation to Claire, Michael smirked, has been quietly building a case based on the evidence we've provided. He's ready to move when we give the signal. Excellent. Now we just need to give William one more push toward paranoia. Rachel turned to Jessica, who had just arrived from the Lancaster mansion. How's our little project coming along? Jessica's grin was positively wicked. Victoria found the sonogram today, exactly where you told me to plant it. She thinks it fell out of William's briefcase. And the name on it? Smudged, just enough to be illegible. She's going out of her mind trying to figure out who the mother is. Rachel allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. Everything was falling into place, each piece of the puzzle clicking perfectly into position. The Lancasters had taught her well, too well, perhaps, about the art of destruction. The next morning, the Lancaster Investment Group boardroom buzzed with tension. William sat at the head of the table, outwardly confident but with dark circles under his eyes betraying his growing stress. Victoria sat 3 seats away, a small but noticeable change from their usual united front. Rachel Hayes made her entrance like a winter storm, beautiful, cold, and promising devastation. "Good morning, everyone," she smiled, her voice carrying that hint of Midwest warmth that made her so disarming. "I believe we have some matters to discuss regarding the firm's recent performance." William's face paled slightly as Rachel's presentation unfolded, revealing concerning patterns in the company's acquisitions and management. She never directly accused, never threatened, she simply presented facts in a way that made the board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Of course, Rachel concluded, this could all be perfectly innocent. But as a significant shareholder, I feel obligated to ensure we're operating with complete transparency. Her eyes met William's, and for a fraction of a second, he saw something familiar in them, something that sent a chill down his spine. "These accusations are baseless," James Morrison interrupted, his face flushed. "Our acquisition strategies are completely legal." Legal? Rachel raised an eyebrow. "I don't recall questioning their legality, Mr. Morrison. Though your defensive response is interesting." Victoria watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, her mind clearly working overtime. Rachel could practically see her connecting the dots, William's mysterious trips, the suspicious financials, the sonogram, and now this threat to their empire. After the meeting, Claire stood quietly in Victoria's office as her employer paced furiously. "That woman," Victoria seethed. "She knows something." The way she looked at William. "She did seem rather focused on the Boston acquisitions," Claire offered innocently. "Especially that new art gallery project." Victoria froze. "Art gallery? What art gallery?" "Oh dear," Claire pressed a hand to her mouth. "I'm sure it's nothing. Just something I overheard Mr. Morrison discussing with Mr. Lancaster. About a redhead named Rebecca." The color drained from Victoria's face. Without a word, she picked up her phone and dialed her family's law firm. "This is Victoria Lancaster. I need to discuss my prenuptial agreement. Immediately." Later that evening, Rachel sat in her penthouse with her team, celebrating the day's successes. "Victoria's lawyers will find plenty of evidence once they start digging," Michael confirmed. "We've made sure of that." "And William?" Rachel asked, sipping her champagne. "Completely paranoid. He's convinced someone's watching him, which, of course, we are. He started checking his office for bugs, switching up his routine. Classic guilty behavior." "Perfect," Rachel smiled. "Now we just need to wait for." Her phone buzzed, a text from Jessica. Rachel's smile widened as she read it aloud. "Victoria just left the mansion with 3 suitcases. She's headed to her family's apartment in the Upper East Side. The board members are already asking questions about William's leadership, Amanda added. Our little presentation today shook their confidence. The stock price dropped 3% just from the rumors of internal investigation. Rachel walked to her window, looking out over the city that had once broken her. You know what the biggest mistake the Lancasters made was? She asked softly. They thought money was power. But real power is knowledge. And they never bothered to look closely at the people they thought weren't worth noticing. She turned back to her team, her expression fierce with triumph. Tomorrow, Claire Thompson goes to work as normal, the perfect assistant watching her employer's world crumble. And Rachel Hayes will be hosting a private dinner for several key board members who are concerned about the company's direction. And William? Michael asked. Rachel's smile was razor-sharp. William will be too busy dealing with a very angry Rebecca Sinclair, who just received some very interesting information about James Morrison's plans to take over her art gallery once the baby is born. You're enjoying this, Michael observed, a hint of admiration in his voice. Enjoying it? Rachel laughed softly. Michael, I'm just getting started. The Lancasters taught me that revenge is a game of patience and precision. Now they're going to learn just how well I paid attention in their master class of destruction. As her team departed for the night, Rachel opened her grandmother's journal, running her fingers over the weathered pages. The best revenge, she read aloud, isn't about making them suffer. It's about making them realize, piece by piece, that they caused their own destruction. Phase 3 was complete. The Lancasters' perfect world was beginning to crack, and through those cracks, Rachel could see their empire starting to crumble. Soon, very soon, they would learn the true cost of underestimating Sarah Mitchell. And this time, she wouldn't leave anything to chance. The Lancaster Investment Group's headquarters buzzed with barely contained chaos. 2 weeks had passed since Victoria's dramatic departure, and William Lancaster's perfectly crafted world was unraveling thread by thread. Claire Thompson stood in her usual spot behind Victoria's empty desk, now temporarily occupied by William as he attempted to contain the damage. His once immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, his tie slightly askew, dark circles under his eyes, and a constant tremor in his hands as he reached for his fourth coffee of the morning. Where are those files from the Boston division? He snapped, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Which ones, Mr. Lancaster? Claire asked innocently. The official reports or the alternate versions? William's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? Oh. Claire's eyes widened with perfectly practiced concern. I'm sorry, I assumed you knew. Mrs. Lancaster had me maintaining separate records of all Boston transactions. She was quite insistent about documenting everything, thoroughly. The color drained from William's face. Show me. Claire pulled out a folder, one that Rachel had prepared months ago, filled with carefully crafted evidence of William's indiscretions, both personal and professional. She watched as he flipped through the pages, his hands shaking more with each document. Who else has seen these? I couldn't say, sir. Mrs. Lancaster had me send copies to her family's lawyers last week. Standard procedure, she said. Meanwhile, across town in the Blackwood family's law offices, Victoria Lancaster sat like an ice queen as her lawyers presented their findings. Rachel Hayes, as the Children's Hope Foundation's CEO and now a significant Lancaster Investment Group shareholder, had been invited to attend. The evidence of systematic fraud is overwhelming, Victoria's lead lawyer explained, spreading documents across the mahogany table. Not just the personal indiscretions, but years of corporate manipulation, targeted harassment, and illegal financial practices. How fascinating, Rachel commented, her voice carrying just a hint of satisfaction. Though I must admit, I'm curious about the timing. These practices seem to have escalated significantly after the Sarah Mitchell incident. Victoria's head snapped up at the name, her eyes narrowing. That was a legitimate business acquisition. Was it? Rachel smiled coldly. My investigation suggests otherwise. In fact, it seems Ms. Mitchell's case was part of a larger pattern, one that might interest the SEC considerably. Are you threatening me, Ms. Hayes? Not at all. I'm merely pointing out that in situations like these, it's often beneficial to be the first one to come forward. Rachel paused, letting the implications sink in. After all, whistleblower protections can be quite generous. Back at Lancaster Investment Group, James Morrison burst into William's temporary office, his face ashen. "We have a problem. Rebecca's lawyer just called. She's filing for full control of the gallery and threatening to go public with everything." William collapsed into his chair. "How much does she know?" "Everything." Morrison wiped sweat from his brow. "Someone sent her copies of all our plans, the gallery takeover, the real estate manipulation, everything. She's threatening to take it to the press unless we sign over full ownership and set up a trust fund for the baby." "A trust fund?" William laughed hysterically. "James, we don't have any money left. The Boston properties are underwater, the New York acquisitions are failing, and now Victoria's lawyers are freezing our major accounts." Claire silently recorded everything on her tablet, while sending real-time updates to Rachel's secure phone. In her penthouse, Rachel reviewed the messages with Michael and Amanda. William spiraling exactly as planned, she noted with satisfaction. "How are our board members responding?" 7 of them have already reached out to schedule private meetings, Michael reported. "They're worried about the SEC investigation and Victoria's lawsuit. Stock prices dropped another 8% today." "And our friend Agent Thompson?" Amanda pulled up a secure email. "The SEC is ready to move. They've been building their case quietly, using the evidence we provided. They're just waiting for our signal." Rachel walked to her window, watching storm clouds gather over Manhattan. Tomorrow's board meeting should be interesting. Especially when they learn about William's secret accounts in the Cayman Islands. "Accounts that don't actually exist," Michael pointed out with a smirk. "They don't have to exist," Rachel smiled. "They just have to be believable enough to trigger a federal investigation. The truth doesn't matter nearly as much as perception, isn't that what William always said?" The next morning, chaos erupted at Lancaster Investment Group. Federal agents swarmed the offices, armed with search warrants and subpoenas. William Lancaster watched in horror as they seized computers and files, his empire crumbling before his eyes. Claire Thompson stood quietly in the corner, recording everything on her tablet, while Rachel Hayes made a perfectly timed appearance in the lobby, surrounded by reporters. "As a major shareholder, I am deeply concerned by these allegations," she announced to the cameras. "The Children's Hope Foundation prides itself on ethical investment and transparency. We will cooperate fully with federal authorities to ensure justice is served." William watched the broadcast on his office TV, his face contorted with rage and fear. "I know her," he muttered. "I've seen her somewhere before." "Sir?" Claire appeared at his elbow with a glass of water. "Perhaps you should sit down. You don't look well." As William sank into his chair, his phone buzzed with a text from Victoria, "Turn on CNN." The breaking news banner made his blood run cold. Lancaster Investment Group under federal investigation, whistleblower reveals years of fraud and manipulation. Victoria's face filled the screen, composed and righteous as she described discovering her husband's shocking pattern of corporate and personal misconduct. "That bitch," William snarled, hurling his phone across the room. "She's trying to save herself by destroying me." "Actually," a familiar voice said from the doorway, "she's just playing her part." William turned to find Claire Thompson removing her glasses, her posture transforming from submissive assistant to something altogether more dangerous. Behind her stood Rachel Hayes, and for the first time, William saw past the careful makeup and subtle prosthetics. "No," he whispered. "It's not possible." "Hello, William," Sarah Mitchell said, her voice carrying 2 years of carefully cultivated vengeance. "Miss me?" William lunged for his desk phone, but Michael Sterling stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path. "I wouldn't," he advised coldly. "Federal agents are already on this floor. One wrong move and you'll add assaulting a witness to your growing list of charges." "Witnesses," Sarah corrected, gesturing between herself and Claire. "Did you really think I'd trust anyone else to be Victoria's perfect assistant? To watch you destroy yourself piece by piece?" William's face contorted with rage. "You did this? All of it? The foundation, the SEC investigation, Victoria's lawsuit. I learned from the best," Sarah smiled coldly. You taught me everything I needed to know about destroying someone's life. I just made a few improvements to your methodology." She walked to Victoria's desk, her desk, really, for the past 2 months, and picked up a framed photo of the Lancasters at a charity gala. "You know what your biggest mistake was, William? You thought power was about making people fear you. But real power? Real power is about making them trust you right up until the moment you take everything they have." "You'll never prove anything," William snarled. "I've covered my tracks." "Like you did with my company?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Or like you did with the other 17 women-owned businesses you destroyed? The ones whose files I've had access to for the past 2 months?" She nodded to Michael, who opened his briefcase and began laying out documents. "Everything is here, William. Every forged signature, every manipulated account, every secret meeting. Victoria's lawyers have copies, the SEC has copies, and in about 10 minutes, every major news outlet in New York will have copies too." "Why?" William's voice cracked. "Why go to all this trouble? You could have just gone to the authorities with evidence of what I did to your company." "Because this was never just about me," Sarah's voice hardened. "This was about every woman you and your father destroyed. This was about my grandmother's store in Boston, and Michael's sister, and all the others who couldn't fight back. You didn't just steal my company, William. You stole their dreams, their dignity, their futures." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And now you get to watch while I take everything from you, piece by piece, just like you taught me. Your money, your reputation, your freedom, it's all going to disappear. And the best part? Everyone will think you did it to yourself." The sound of approaching footsteps made William look up in panic. Agent Thompson appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 other FBI agents. "William Lancaster," Thompson began, "you're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy." As the agents led William away in handcuffs, Sarah watched from Victoria's office window, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her victory. The storm she had carefully cultivated was breaking at last, and William Lancaster's empire was washing away in the flood. "Well played," Michael said softly, coming to stand beside her. "Your grandmother would be proud." Sarah touched the window, watching William's figure disappear into a federal vehicle below. "She told me once that revenge wouldn't make me feel better. Does it?" "No," Sarah smiled, turning to face him. "But justice does." In the distance, thunder rolled over Manhattan, heralding the end of the Lancaster dynasty and the beginning of something new. Sarah Mitchell had returned, not just to take back what was hers, but to ensure the Lancasters could never hurt anyone else again. The game was nearly over, but the final act was still to come. The headlines dominated every news outlet in New York. Lancaster Investment Group CEO arrested in massive fraud scheme. Victoria Lancaster files for divorce, claims whistleblower status. Corporate predator, the fall of William Lancaster. Rachel Hayes appointed interim CEO of Lancaster Investment Group. Sarah Mitchell stood in her grandmother's Vermont farmhouse kitchen, watching the sunrise paint the hills gold. It had been 3 days since William's arrest, and the world she'd so carefully orchestrated was shifting into its final configuration. "You haven't slept," Eleanor observed, placing a cup of lavender tea in front of her granddaughter. "Victory keeping you up?" Sarah smiled tiredly, touching the familiar chip in the old ceramic mug. "Not victory. Responsibility. There are over 300 employees at Lancaster Investment Group who had nothing to do with William's schemes. Their lives are in my hands now. And that, my dear," Eleanor sat across from her, "is why you deserve to win." William never lost sleep over the lives he affected. Sarah's phone buzzed, Michael's name lighting up the screen. "The board meeting's about to start," he reported. "Victoria's lawyers are already here, and James Morrison is trying to make a deal with the prosecutors." "Let him squirm," Sarah replied, her voice hardening. "We have enough evidence to bury him alongside William." After saying goodbye to Eleanor, Sarah made the drive back to Manhattan, transforming herself one last time into Rachel Hayes. The Lancaster Investment Group's headquarters felt different now, the fear and tension replaced by a cautious hope. In the boardroom, Victoria Lancaster sat like a queen in exile, her designer outfit in perfect makeup a shield against reality. Her eyes widened slightly as Rachel Hayes entered, followed by Michael Sterling and a team of lawyers. "Before we begin," Rachel announced, taking her place at the head of the table, "I believe some introductions are in order." She reached up and carefully removed the prosthetics that had subtly altered her features for months. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I believe Mrs. Lancaster and I have some unfinished business." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Victoria's face drained of color. "You, all this time?" "Claire Thompson sends her regards," Sarah smiled coldly. "She was an excellent assistant, wasn't she? So attentive, so thorough in her documentation." Victoria's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. "You used me. Like you and William used me? Like you used all those other women whose businesses you destroyed?" Sarah's voice carried 2 years of carefully contained fury. "The difference is, I'm giving your employees a chance to keep their jobs. More mercy than you ever showed." She nodded to Michael, who distributed folders to each board member. "Inside you'll find 2 documents. The first is evidence of your individual complicity in William's schemes. Yes, all of you knew something was wrong, and none of you spoke up. The second is an offer of immunity in exchange for your cooperation in rebuilding this company legitimately." The board members flipped through the pages with shaking hands, their faces pale. "You're blackmailing us," one of them accused. "I prefer to think of it as aggressive negotiation," Sarah replied smoothly. "You have 1 hour to decide. Choose wisely." As the board members huddled with their lawyers, Victoria stood abruptly. "What about me? I cooperated with the investigation." "You cooperated to save yourself," Sarah corrected. "But don't worry, your immunity deal with the SEC stands. You get to keep your freedom and your family's money. The company, however." She smiled, and for a moment, Victoria saw the ghost of Claire Thompson's efficient ruthlessness. "The company is mine. Why go to all this trouble?" Victoria demanded. "Why not just expose William from the beginning? Because this was never just about William, or you, or even me." Sarah walked to the window, looking out over the city she'd fought so hard to conquer. "This was about changing the system that allowed people like you to prey on others. The Lancaster name is going to stand for something different now." She turned back to the room, her voice carrying the strength of every woman who'd been wronged by the Lancasters. "The Children's Hope Foundation will remain, but with a new mission, supporting women entrepreneurs and protecting them from corporate predators. Every business you stole will be offered a chance at restoration. And you, Victoria, get to watch from the sidelines as your family's legacy is transformed into everything you fought against." Victoria's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms. "You think you've won? You think wearing designer clothes and running a company makes you one of us?" "No, Victoria," Sarah's smile was genuine now. "I think it makes me better than you. Because unlike you, I know the value of what I've built, and the responsibility that comes with it." One by one, the board members signed their agreements. By sunset, Sarah Mitchell officially became CEO of the renamed Mitchell Hayes Group, with Michael Sterling as her COO. Later that evening, Sarah stood in her penthouse, no longer Rachel Hayes' luxury apartment, but her own hard-won territory. Michael joined her at the window, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "To justice," he offered, handing her a glass. "To responsibility," she corrected, clinking her glass against his. "The easy part is over. Now comes the real work." "You know," Michael said softly, "my sister would have loved what you've done. She always said the system needed to change from within." Sarah turned to him, seeing the pain and pride mingled in his eyes. Over the months of planning and execution, their relationship had evolved from allies to something deeper, something neither had dared to name yet. "I couldn't have done it without you," she acknowledged. "Any of it?" "Yes, you could have," he smiled. "But I'm glad you didn't have to." Sarah's phone buzzed with a news alert: William Lancaster had been denied bail. The photo showed him in prison orange, his arrogance finally stripped away. Another alert followed: James Morrison had accepted a plea deal, agreeing to testify against his former partner. "It doesn't feel like I thought it would," Sarah admitted, setting down her glass. "The victory, I mean." "Because you're not done," Michael understood. This was never just about revenge for you. No, she agreed, pulling out her grandmother's journal. It was about making sure no one else has to go through what we did. What your sister did. What all those other women did. She opened the journal to a page she'd read countless times. The true measure of victory isn't in what you take, but in what you build from the ashes. Michael stepped closer, his presence warm and steady beside her. So what do you want to build, Sarah Mitchell? She looked out at the city lights, seeing not the past's shadows but the future's possibilities. Something that lasts. Something that matters. Something that changes the rules of the game. Well then, he smiled, taking her hand, I guess we better get to work. The night stretched out before them, full of promise and potential. Sarah Mitchell had returned to take everything from those who had wronged her, but in doing so, she'd found something she hadn't expected, a purpose bigger than revenge, a partner who understood her darkness and her light, and a chance to transform her pain into power for others. The game wasn't over. It was just changing into something new, something better. And this time, Sarah Mitchell wasn't just playing to win, she was playing to change the world. 1 year after William Lancaster's arrest, the Mitchell-Hayes Group headquarters buzzed with a different kind of energy. Gone were the days of fear and manipulation, replaced by an atmosphere of innovation and empowerment. Sarah Mitchell's office, once Victoria Lancaster's fortress of intimidation, had been transformed into a bright, welcoming space with walls of glass and views of the Manhattan skyline. The last of the restoration contracts are ready for your signature, Jessica announced, placing a stack of documents on Sarah's desk. No longer an assistant but now the director of corporate rehabilitation, Jessica had been instrumental in helping rebuild the businesses the Lancasters had destroyed. Sarah picked up the first contract, the return of a successful tech company to its original founder, Emma Chen. How many does this make now? 15 restored businesses, all women-owned, Jessica smiled proudly. And the Children's Hope Foundation has provided startup funding to 20 new entrepreneurs this quarter alone. The foundation, now genuinely dedicated to supporting women in business, had become a powerful force for change in the corporate world. Sarah's story, finally revealed in full, had inspired a movement, with other companies adopting similar protective measures against corporate raiders. A knock at the door interrupted them. Michael entered, his smile warming as it always did when he saw Sarah. Their relationship had blossomed over the past year, built on a foundation of shared purpose and understanding. The visitors are here, he announced. Sarah stood, smoothing her silk blouse, no more disguises needed, just her own confident style. In the conference room? Actually, Michael's eyes twinkled, they insisted on meeting somewhere more appropriate. They're waiting at the Grand Horizon Hotel. Sarah's breath caught. The hotel where everything had fallen apart 2 years ago. Of course they would choose there, it was perfectly fitting for what she had planned. In the hotel's grand ballroom, a small but significant group had gathered. Eleanor Hayes sat regally in the front row, beside Marcus and Amanda Chen. Jessica took her place among them, while Michael stood supportively at Sarah's side. At precisely noon, the doors opened to admit 2 prison guards escorting William Lancaster, dressed in an orange jumpsuit that no designer could make elegant. His year in prison had aged him, stripping away the polished veneer to reveal the broken man beneath. Victoria Lancaster entered separately, still glamorous but somehow diminished, followed by James Morrison, who had served 6 months before his plea deal set him free. Thank you all for coming, Sarah addressed the room, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd earned. I know some of you are here by choice, others by subpoena, but your presence matters regardless. She walked to the spot where, 2 years ago, she had learned of their betrayal. In this room, you took everything from me. My company, my reputation, my future, or so you thought. But today, we're here for something different. We're here for closure. William shifted uncomfortably in his shackles. If this is some kind of victory lap. No, William, Sarah cut him off smoothly. This is about responsibility, something you never understood. You see, when you destroy someone's life, you don't just hurt them. You hurt everyone connected to them, their employees, their families, their communities. She nodded to Michael, who distributed folders to everyone present. Inside you'll find documentation of every business the Lancasters destroyed over the past 20 years, including my grandmother's store in Boston. You'll also find proof that the Mitchell-Hayes Group has restored or compensated every single victim of your schemes. Victoria opened her folder with trembling hands. This must have cost millions. It did, Sarah confirmed. Paid for with the profits you accumulated through fraud. But more importantly, it cost time, effort, and dedication from people who believed in doing the right thing. She turned to William. Your sentence included restitution payments, but we both know you hid money offshore. Today, you have a choice. Sign over those accounts to the Restoration Fund voluntarily, or I'll make sure every financial institution in the world knows exactly how you operated. Your choice. William's face contorted with familiar rage, but there was something else there now: defeat. You really did learn from me, didn't you? No, William. I learned from your mistakes. You taught me how to destroy, but my grandmother taught me how to build. That's why I'm not just taking your money, I'm using it to fix what you broke. One by one, Sarah handed out additional documents, legal agreements, restoration plans, and most importantly, a new corporate ethics code that would become industry standard. James, she addressed Morrison, who had been trying to shrink into his chair. Your plea deal required you to implement these protections in your company. How's that working out? We're adapting, he muttered. Profits are actually up since we stopped the aggressive acquisitions. Imagine that, Sarah's smile was razor-sharp. Ethical business practices being profitable. Who would have thought? She saved Victoria for last. Your family's law firm has agreed to establish a pro bono division specifically for protecting small business owners. You'll be pleased to know the Blackwood name is finally associated with something positive. Victoria's perfectly painted lips trembled. Why are you doing this? You won. You took everything. Because winning wasn't enough, Sarah's voice softened slightly. Someone had to break the cycle. Someone had to show that there's a better way to do business, to build success, to create legacy. She walked to her grandmother, taking Eleanor's hand. 40 years ago, the Lancasters stole my family's dream. Today, we're not just taking it back, we're making it bigger, better, and available to anyone willing to work for it honestly. Michael stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder. The Mitchell-Hayes Group is launching a nationwide initiative, he announced. Every major city will have a business incubator specifically for women entrepreneurs, with built-in legal protection against corporate raiders. We're calling it the Phoenix Program, Sarah added. Because sometimes, you have to burn everything down to build something better from the ashes. William signed the offshore account transfers with shaking hands. Victoria left quickly, her designer heels clicking a retreat across marble floors. James Morrison lingered, looking lost. What happens now? He asked quietly. Now. Sarah looked around the ballroom, remembering the night she'd thought her world had ended. Now we build. Now we grow. Now we show the world that success doesn't have to come at someone else's expense. As the guards led William away for the last time, Sarah turned to Michael. There's one more thing we need to discuss. He raised an eyebrow. Oh? She pulled out one final document. The merger paperwork you proposed last week. I have some amendments. Professional or personal? His eyes sparkled. Both, she smiled, taking his hand. I think it's time we made this partnership official, in every way. Later that evening, Sarah stood in her grandmother's farmhouse kitchen, just as she had that first night after losing everything. But now the kitchen was filled with family, blood and chosen, celebrating not just her victory, but the beginning of something new. You know, Eleanor said, handing her another cup of lavender tea, your grandfather used to say that any fool can tear something down. The real test of character is what you build in its place. Sarah looked around at her team, now her family. Michael discussing security protocols with Marcus, Amanda teaching Jessica coding tricks, all of them part of something bigger than revenge. We're building something that will last, she said confidently. Something that matters. Yes, Eleanor smiled, touching the engagement ring Michael had given Sarah that afternoon. Yes, you are. Outside, the Vermont hills glowed in the sunset, just as they had when a broken Sarah Mitchell had driven up this driveway 2 years ago. But she wasn't broken anymore. She was stronger, wiser, and most importantly, she was no longer alone. William Lancaster had left her with nothing, but she had returned to take it all. And in taking it all, she had found something far more valuable than revenge. She had found purpose, love, and the power to change not just her own story, but countless others. The game was over, but the legacy was just beginning.